One of the things that I love is if you have your Bibles and you turn to Ephesians chapter 6, we'll be there. One of the things I love about this time of year is all the stuff that starts getting posted on Facebook. So there's this sweet spot, somewhere around the 2nd of September to the second week of September to about the second week of October, where it's fall in Idaho. And so all of the people that love summer don't like that season because it starts to cool off at night. It's a little bit cooler in the morning. And everybody that hates summer and loves the fall and kind of colder seasons, that's like their sweet spot. They get about a month. They get 4 weeks, right? So inevitably what happens every year, and maybe you're newish or newer to Idaho and this is your first fall, like the weather's really beautiful for that month season. And then sometime around the second or third week of October, it starts to get really cold in the morning and it starts to rain and it gets a little muddy and it gets a little gross. And this week it's happened. If you haven't seen it on your Facebook feed, I've certainly seen it on mine. This is when all the summer people go, well, thanks a lot, fall people. Now it's just cold, rainy, and muddy for the rest of the year. And they don't like it. And so what happens is they struggle between liking summer and liking fall, and then realizing that winter is coming. And I'm thinking of one person in particular who just so doesn't like the cold weather that they completely miss everything. They just don't enjoy it at all. And so they have this season from the second week of October till probably June where they just don't enjoy life because it's cold outside and it's windy in Idaho. You guys know what I'm talking about? If you're a farmer, you know what I'm talking about. Mike's back there shaking his head, yeah. And so we think about it in terms of in seasons and work and rhythms of life, summer, spring, fall, winter. But often we miss it when we think about in seasons of life in our kids. And it's valuable to think about as we think about how we raise our kids and what it looks like. And what we have to understand is that God has you in the season that you're in for a reason. Who in here has kids? All of your kids are under the age of 6 right now. Raise your hand. Everybody look around. You see those people with their hands raised? You need to be praying desperately for them. Listen, God has you in this season for a reason. And you have to learn the purpose of the season that you're in, or you won't be ready for the next season that He's going to move you into. Don't be so anxious, and it doesn't matter, maybe you have junior high kids and you're just waiting for them to get into high school and so that there's a little bit more mobility on their own. You don't have to drive them everywhere. Or maybe you have kids that are in high school or just recently graduated, or maybe they've already graduated, and maybe they're in their 30s or 40s, and you're sitting here and you're going, when are they going to grow up and start making good decisions? My mother-in-law just looked at my wife. Oh, I'm going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Don't be so anxious for the there that you miss the here God has you in right now. Don't be so anxious for what is to come that you miss what God is preparing for you in this place and in this season. He has you here for a purpose. And this isn't just a Sunday morning message. And I was talking with the team, and they were back prepping for the deal, and I was in the corridor typing away, and Bill's like, "Hey, how's it going?" And I said, I kind of rewrote the message this morning as I was spending time in prayer this morning, and it was thinking about it, and I was looking at it, and I was like, you know what? We need to keep junior high kids in today, and we're going to split this message into 2 weeks. And so if you have your sermon guides and you follow along with them, we have paper copies or we have a digital copy as well. We're probably going to get through number 1 and number 2, maybe number 3. But don't get too anxious if we don't fill it all out. I promise we'll come back next week and we'll finish filling it out. But I want to start reading in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. It says this: "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." I really thought I was going to get some amens from parents there, but amen. Paul is continuing here in this verse the theme from 521 where he says that we should submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He's continuing this idea that as Christians, we submit to one another. He's saying for children, you have a duty to obey your parents. Now, he does put a caveat on there. He says, in the Lord. So it doesn't mean that you have to you have to obey if they're asking you to do something that goes against God's will for your life that's revealed in His Word. It doesn't mean that you have to live under or deal with a physical abuse or God forbid, sexual abuse. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying that we should obey. And it was the Greek word. You can learn a lot if you look at the original language. And do you know what the original Greek word for obey means? It just means obey. It just means, kids, if your mom and dad say to pick up your room, guess what you do? You pick up your room. If mom and dad say, hey, your curfew's 11, guess what? You're home by 11. There's no secret thing. It just means obey. There's nothing else about it. And what's interesting, the word children, now there is a little bit more. It doesn't just mean children that are born to you. It means that if you're living under the roof of somebody, like for example, you're eating their food, or you're using their electricity, their hot water, and all of those things, and you're living in their house. Maybe you don't belong. Maybe they weren't your birth parents. Maybe you're just living in someone's house for a season, or you're renting a room or something like that. The idea applies to you too. So maybe you've graduated from high school and you're still living in your parents' house. And guess what? They get to set standards and rules that you have to follow and obey. Now, it's not just an action that he says here. He also calls us to an attitude. We continue to read. It says in verse 2, it says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with the promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So this idea that we're called as children, even me, even though I'm living under, but to obey and honor my parents. And so obeying looks a little bit different when you get to my age and we have our own family, but I'm certainly called to honor my mother and father. And so what does it look like? I don't know what it looks like for you, but for me, honoring my mom and dad is just, it really, to the point in my life, it's communication. I just call my mom, I call my dad. There was this, and I'll be honest, and my mom may watch this, and Mom, if you watch this later, I apologize. But I would internally groan when my phone would ring and I would see her name. It's like, ah. And I'm embarrassed to admit that. But I was dishonoring to my mother with that attitude. And so as children, we just have two minimal obligations to our parents. So if you're a child of somebody, raise your hand. It's not a trick question. Every hand should be raised. Let's say this. If you're under 18, raise your hand. You're still living at home, okay? Two minimal obligations. This is the least that you're required to do. The least that you're required to do is obedience and honor. If you're a child living at home under your parents' roof, the least that you could get away with doing is obeying and honoring. And I can guarantee you, if we did a small poll after church, and if we had a chance to talk to every mom and dad, and you just said, hey, if your kids just obeyed and honored you, would that be good? And you'd be like, that's not minimal. That would be incredible. That would be a life fully well lived, wouldn't it? If our kids would just obey and honor us. And I'm not going to get into what honoring looks like today, that we don't have a lot of time today, especially since I'm already cutting it short and we're spreading it into 2 weeks. But there's this idea that honor is not just a one-time act. It's a life lived honoring. It's one of those circular definitions, like how do you honor your parents? It's just a life of honoring your parents. And we'll get more into it next week, I promise, but I want to keep reading in Ephesians chapter 6 and look at verse 4, because this is really where I want to spend the bulk of our time to this week, or today and next week. But it says this in verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, it's really interesting, and I've got something caught in my throat, but let's just figure it out. Notice in verse 1, it doesn't say, parents, get your kids to obey. It says, children, obey your parents. So it doesn't say, get your kids to obey. And then in verse 4, it says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. So now it's interesting, and moms, you're not off the hook, but the reason Paul is addressing fathers is because in Roman society, there was this, in studying it, it's unbelievable that this was a practice that they did. But when a family would have a child, in a Roman family, Roman citizen, the mother would bring that baby to the father, and the father would stand there, and the father had one of two options. He could pick up and accept that child into the family, or the other option, he would turn his back on the child and walk away, and then that child was not part of the family. And often that child was then sold into slavery, and it didn't matter if the parents were married, but that was the option. Those were the two options. Could you imagine that today? It's actually not really hard, because a great portion of society would say that moms have a right. They're choosing on what to do, but instead of selling their child into slavery, they're ending the life. But so when Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, the assumption that Paul is saying, he's taking societal norms and flipping it on their head. So the choice belonged to the father whether to accept the child or not. And Paul's saying, listen, not only should you accept the child, you shouldn't provoke that child to anger. It's not a choice of whether you want to have the child or you're going to accept the child as their own. They're given a responsibility. And it echoes verse 4 of Ephesians chapter 6, echoes Proverbs 22:6, and you can just write that out on the side of your notes. It says this, train up a child in the way that they should go, and even when they are old, they will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way that they should go, so even when they're old, they will not depart from it. And so there are some things that we can learn just from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, and Proverbs 22:6, and some of them are just very simple. Parents are commanded by God to start kids on a path towards a certain direction. If you're a mom or a dad, you have a responsibility to point your kid in a certain direction. And not only point them in a certain direction, but to take them by the hand and start walking down that path and leading them to the place that they should go. It's not just kind of kick them in the backside and say, good luck. We should walk along with them. As parents, we're called to train our children, and that looks different in every family, and we're not going to talk about, what that looks like in specifics for each and every family, but we're called to train our children. And then what's great about it is there's a promise attached to it that when they're old, they won't depart from it. Now listen, I recognize and realize that there probably are people sitting in this room today or maybe watching online later that you say to yourself, I feel like I did everything right, and my children, when they were older, they've turned away from the Lord. As parents, we can only do so much. That's why free will is involved, right? And so you may find yourself in that season where you're like, my kids are not following the Lord. How does this apply? How do I apply this to my life? I'm a grandparent. My kids, maybe they're not following, but they are following the Lord, and I don't have it in my house. And so this is all great and good, but I'm past that season of life. I would challenge you that you're not past that season of life. Because what you can't see, or maybe you can from there, but what I can see from here there are kids dotting this audience all over the place. And I promise you, if nobody else wants your help, I want your help in raising my kids. I want you investing in my kids. I want you living a life that points my kids in the direction that they should go. And so while you may not have kids at home, this message is for you because you're a part of raising my kids. You're a part of raising all of the kids that are sitting in here today. So you don't get off the hook. So let's just talk about what training a child might look like, in the way that they should go, what that might look like. In the first one, and this is in your sermon guide, and they'll put it up on the screen, is this, that you clearly identify the destination. I love that, right? You clearly identify the destination. The goal of every godly parent should be this: to raise followers of Jesus. That should be the first goal, that you raise followers of Jesus. And the second goal, and these aren't any place you can write, but you can write them down, is that you raise people of godly character. Followers of Jesus and godly character. And so we clearly identify the destination. And I love the Hargans. They've done this. Glenn and Cheryl, they've done it. They were walking in today. I said, it's coming today, guys. Be ready. And they, bring it. Come on. So listen, a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember what we were preaching on, but it was on a Sunday morning, and I was getting ready for church. I have this little routine that I do, and kind of one of the last things that I do before service starts is I walk in the bathroom, and I just, I give myself like a, make sure everything looks good. I haven't spilled coffee on myself. The shirt's all tucked in. The hair's in place. I want to look good, right? And so I walk in, and two of the three Hargan boys are in the bathroom. And they're standing in front of the mirror, and their hair's wet. And Glenn was working. Glenn's a fireman, and so sometimes he has to work on Sundays. Thank you for your service, by the way. If you get an opportunity to shake his hand, and he puts his life on the line every time he goes to work. And so it was just Cheryl and the three boys. And so they were put together well. Cheryl's always got them put together well. Maybe they thought their hair wasn't just right, and so they went in the bathroom to do their hair. And so their hair, you guys, shortcut, right? You get some water on it. You can just, I brushed it and touched my head today, and my hair looks good. I just did this right here, right? And my hair's combed. Every teenage girl's like, my hair takes like 6 hours. I just go like this. It's done. And so I walk in, and I'm like, hey, fellas, what's going on? What are you doing? And they just said, we're getting ready for Jesus. Clearly define the destination. Now, and this illustration is going to come up later, and I could stop the illustration here. It would be good, but I want the payoff, so I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. As I look, I'm saying, hi, how's it going? And I look down, and I see drops of water all over the floor. And I go, the sink's right there, and I look over, and the water leads from them to the urinals on the wall. And I look at the boys, and I go, where'd you get the water? I'm not going to tell you which one. One of them said, the sink. And the other one said, don't lie, we got it from the toilets. Now listen, we laugh, right? And there's a whole lesson there about, like, our best being like muck and mire, right? And like filthy rags and Jesus and all, right? That's a great application. But here's the thing, dude. They want to get ready for Jesus. Mom and dad clearly define the destination for their boys. And so it might look different for you. I don't know if any of you have a family motto. That might be something that you think about. Do something as simply as like love God, love people, like which is what we're called to do. Do you spend more time talking about Jesus and what life could look like following him, or do you spend more time watching TV? Do you spend more time talking and praying with your kids, or do you spend more time watching your favorite football team? Do you spend more time talking to your kids about how their day went and the struggles that they had, or do you spend more time on social media? And I'm not cherry picking y'all. I'm talking about the things that I struggle with. If you want your kids to follow Jesus, if you want your kids to have a godly character, if you want your kids to, you have to clearly define the destination for them. It's intentional. It doesn't happen by accident or mistake. It's purposeful. My parents didn't define the destination for me. And I lived 18 and a half, 19 years of just, ugh. Now thank God some older godly men came into my life and began to clearly define the destination for me. But if you want to raise godly kids that follow Jesus and are people of character, you have to clearly identify the destination. And secondly, right, destinations are good, but you gotta know how to get there, so you gotta map the routes. There's a certain subsect of my family that does not do good with directions. I'm not going to mention any names. But there are two particular people in my family that are horrible with directions. One of them, they're always like, how do I get here? And I go, I'm not telling you. You just got to figure it out. We were here yesterday. And they don't get they're not happy. And they're like, just tell me to just turn left or just turn right. And I said, well, where's it at? They're like, well, it's over here. And I said, so which direction is that in? They go, well, it's to the right. I said, so which way do you think you should turn? And they go, right? And I don't answer. I said, I'm not telling you. And so sometimes mapping the route, like we've talked to our kids about things, right? Sometimes mapping the route is not holding their hand all the way through everything. Hey, guess what? If you've got a kid and they're in high school or junior high or elementary school and they play sports, they're going to lose. And you know what? It's not the ref's fault. It's not the coach's fault. That's part of life. Sometimes you just lose. Middleton football team, junior high football team, man, they got smoked. It was like 58-0. Maybe it was 58-6, Cooper. It was bad. And Coop was frustrated. And my response to him was, dude, man, sometimes you just lose. And so mapping the route, right, it's part of defining that destination, but it's not coddling our kids all of the time. It's holding them accountable to some things that we're going to talk about later. But if we're going to map the route, if we want our kids to be godly people, what do we have to do? We have to show them what godly people look like. And so what does that require? Who do they see more than anybody else? Parents. Sending your child to youth group or in all Young Life or campaigners or any of those things for 1 or 2 hours a week and expecting those people to fix your kids is not going to solve your problem. They spend the majority of their time with you. And so if you want your kids to be godly kids, guess what they got to see? They're going to see godly parents living in their house. And so what does that look like? I'm glad you asked. It looks like establishing family mission and core values. Anybody have a mission statement for your family? Does anybody have any core values for your family? So, like, if everything burns down, you lose, everything's gone in a fire, and it's just you and your family, what are your family about? What defines you as a group of people? Are you about serving others? Are you about loving God and loving people? Or what does that look like? Do you have core values? Do you have a mission as a family? Anybody feel like you're just in a season that your mission, that all it is just to survive? I'll raise my hand because I'm in that season right now. I'm just trying to survive. But we have a larger mission, right? We want to raise kids that love Jesus and love people. So it looks like setting that mission of those core values. It's helping your kids make a decision and decide on what they want to be. Man, I wish I would have asked permission to share this story, but I didn't, so I can't. Listen, you don't get to decide what your child's going to do. They get to decide that. But you can help them. You have great influence. But you know what you can decide for your kids? You can decide what you want them to know. Well, how does that work? You talk about the things that you want them to know. Now, listen, this is not in any way a public school or private school or homeschool conversation. All of those things may navigate for families, in that each family gets to decide what works well for them, okay? And I'm not saying one's better than the other. I think they all have their benefits. I think they all have their drawbacks. My kids have been in public school their entire career. And up through junior high, my kids had more teachers that were Christians and believers than they didn't. Now, high school's another thing because they've got so many teachers. But our kids would come home and they would be in a science class is what I think about, right? They talk about evolution and all of those kinds of things. And so they're being instructed that in the school environment. And so how do I handle that as a parent? I talk about a biblical worldview with my kids. I talk to them about Genesis. I tell them why I believe that Genesis is accurate and true, and I show them how I believe science and archaeology backs that up. I don't just say to them, oh, we don't believe that. Because if your kids, especially if they're in public school, they don't have teachers that are just saying this is what we believe. They have teachers that are showing them all kinds of things, and you can make anything back up any statement that you want. And so just to say to Savannah, oh, we don't believe that. Just don't listen to them. We don't believe that. That's hard. It's hard for her, and her mind is inquisitive. And so I tell her why we believe what we believe, and I show her, and you know what that requires of me? It requires that I know what I believe. You guys get the feeling of where we're going with the message today and where it's going to go next week, and you may be like, man, this is really uncomfortable. I'm not showing up next week. If you don't show up next week, man, then that's on you, but I'm going to tell you next week's even better than this week. And that's kind of like patting myself on the back. I got to be careful. I might go sideways really fast here. It's all great and good, but man, parents, look at me. If you're not following Jesus with everything that you have, how can you expect to lead the one that's watching you? It's like Paul says when he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. I can tell Cooper I want him to be a man of character where his yes is yes and his no is his no. But what do I speak to him when I promise Harper that I'll hang lights in her underneath her bunk bed for like a month and a half, and it doesn't happen? I teach him, I'm not being a man of character. I made a promise, and I didn't follow up on it. And it's something simple, right? You're like, oh, it's just lights. Don't beat yourself up. It's a promise to my daughter. I said I would do it, and I didn't do it. And so I speak with my mouth out of one side saying, Cooper, be a man of honor. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And my actions tell him something completely different. So can I really be upset with him when he follows my actions? I can hold him accountable, and I can train, and I can correct, and I can accept responsibility for where I faltered. Listen, if you want to raise kids of godly character and kids that follow Jesus, it starts